Good morning, church. Welcome back to our morning devotions. These past couple days, we've talked about the book of Ecclesiastes, which is one of the wisdom books of the Bible. And it's a little bit of a tough read because it begins with a lot of negative language and mindset. And that's because we're kind of following the mental working out process of the character called the preacher, who was probably Solomon. We're following his thought process as he works out these difficult concepts about humanity and about justice and righteousness and unfairness. And as he does that, he uses the word hevel a lot, which we see translated either as meaningless or vanity. All is vanity, he says. Life is basically trying to grasp at the wind. You'll never get it. That's the kind of tone that's set early on in the book. But as we saw yesterday, there is hope even in that. Even in that kind of depressed, woeful observation of a broken world, there's still hope. And there's still good to be done. And the author of the book of Ecclesiastes, who is a separate character from the preacher, comes back at the end of the book, as we saw yesterday, and explains that hopefulness. He informs us that even though the preacher's outlook was often bleak, still he pursues the use of his gifts to benefit others by teaching and laying down proverbs and using useful words to educate and to enlighten. He still pursued good work, even though it seemed pointless. And it often does feel pointless, doesn't it? When we work for something and we expect it to work out a certain way and then it doesn't. And all that work is for nothing. And does it even matter? Well, let's look at some verses here in chapter 1 that kind of go into this idea. So this is chapter 1, verses 3 through 7 of the book of Ecclesiastes. What profit has a man from all his labor, in which he toils under the sun? One generation passes away, and another generation comes, but the earth abides forever. The sun also rises, and the sun goes down, and hastens to the place where it arose. The wind goes toward the south, and turns toward the north. The wind whirls about continually, and comes again on its circuit. All the rivers run into the sea, yet the sea is not full. To the place from which the rivers come, there they return again. Now, I have 5 little kids, and probably 80% of the time when I ask them to do something, the response I get is, yes, Dad, which is great. But the other 20% can be kind of rough. Usually it's some variation of, why do I have to do this? Or why do I always have to do this? Or why do I have to fold laundry? I'm just going to wear it again and get it dirty again. And I always just sort of nod and I say, you're right. You are just going to wear it again. But it is still good to fold it and put it away. And I don't know if either of us has ever actually won that argument, but in the end they do fold it and they do put it away, either because they realize it's the right thing to do or because I just make them do it. Now, this set of verses that we just read is basically the grown-up wealthy king version of the why do I have to fold my laundry argument. So let's look at it a little closer. What profit has a man from all his labor? We kind of talked about this yesterday in that Solomon, who was just surrounded by treasures and wealth and privilege and power, ultimately found it all meaningless. And how that's the way it is in the end. That our work may satisfy some earthly needs like food and shelter and so on, but it doesn't in itself accomplish anything for our salvation or for eternal joy. No matter how hard a man works, what happens? Verse 4. One generation passes away and another generation comes, but the earth abides forever. So no matter how hard you work, no matter how much you accomplish, you are going to die. Generations pass and new ones come up. The preacher touches on this in chapter 9, where he says in verse 2, all things come alike to all. One event happens to the righteous and the wicked, to the good, the clean, and the unclean, to him who sacrifices and him who does not sacrifice. As is the good, so is the sinner. He who takes an oath, as he who fears an oath. Just as God's mercy means the sun shines and the rain falls on the just and the unjust, so too do all men end up facing death. And So what good does it do to labor? One generation passes, and another generation comes. And likewise, the sun also rises, it says in verse 5, and the sun goes down, and it hastens to the place where it arose, and the days just keep going by regardless of what we do. We can't stop it. We can't change it. The wind goes toward the south and the north. It whirls about continually. All the rivers run into the sea, but it's never full because the water evaporates and it cycles back to the earth as rain and so on. And the earth abides forever, he says. It just keeps going. Men live and men die. And then, if that's the injury, that we all face death equally, then here's the insult. Once we're gone, nobody's going to remember us. Chapter 9, verses 14 and 15 touch on this, and it's in several other places in Ecclesiastes too, that no matter what we do, how good or how bad, how accomplished or trivial our lives are, the world will move on, and it will forget us. I mean, think about all the people that you've ever learned about, all the names of history that you remember. Thomas Edison, Albert Einstein, Harriet Tubman, Benjamin Franklin, Michael Jordan, Susan B. Anthony, Jackie Robinson, Attila the Hun, or Marie Curie, or Charlemagne, or Pontius Pilate. 100, or maybe a couple of hundred people if you spent an afternoon thinking about it. A couple of hundred people out of tens of billions who have lived on the earth. History will forget you. We might as well assume as much. History doesn't care about people. All is vanity. A person's life is a blink, a blip, and it amounts to nothing. So just as a side note, think about the contrast that gives us when we think about Jesus. If history doesn't remember people, how amazing is it that the name of God has been shared for thousands of years, and that Jesus Christ's life is not only remembered, but heavily chronicled. It's detailed. It's so intensely illustrated and remembered. And we know more about Jesus than any other historical figure. Think about that. And not just do we know about Jesus, but we know Jesus. We know God. We have relationship with him because he is God. Isn't that marvelous? Don't you just marvel at that? That men's lives are momentary and inconsequential, and yet Jesus is the most important person who has ever lived, so much so that we not only recognize that he existed, but we worship him. Only God could manage that. Only God could become a man, a short-lived and utterly unremarkable creature that Ecclesiastes 3 verse 19 says is just another animal, and be worthy of worship. For all of the vanity that is men's existence, for all of the meaninglessness that is man, Jesus is meaningful. For the rest of us, though, our lives are not to be lived to try and make history. It's probably not going to matter in the grand scheme. It's pointless to pursue fame and recognition. That is grasping at the wind. And yet, the preacher says in chapter 2, verse 24, "Nothing is better for a man than that he should eat and drink, and that he should enjoy good in his labor." Because it is still good to do what is good, even if just to work. Chapter 5, verse 12 says the same thing. Even the downcast preacher speaking here recognizes the inherent goodness in goodness. Even though the world may reward the wicked and we die just the same, it is still good to do good and to work hard. That's from chapter 9, verse 10. The preacher throughout, even in his melancholy, says that working hard allows us to sleep, but more importantly, that there is a work of God in it. Chapter 8, verses 16 and 17. There's a work of God in doing good work. Well, what kind of work? I think honestly it's clear. If we put this in the context of other scripture, you're going to come upon Philippians chapter 2. Paul is writing to that church. It's a faithful church that Paul has spent time with. And he says in chapter 2, verses 12 through 16, these verses. Therefore, my beloved, as you have always obeyed, not as in my presence only, but now much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who works in you, both to will and to do for his good pleasure. There's a work of God in doing good, and we should do it for his good pleasure, not for fame or for material gain. Verse 14. Do all things without complaining and disputing, that you may become blameless and harmless, children of God without fault in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world. The world is corrupt, and it's unfair, and it's a struggle, but it is still important. It's more important because of that to pursue righteousness. Verse 16, holding fast the word of life, so that I may rejoice in the day of Christ, that I have not run in vain or labored in vain. Do you see what Paul's trying to say there? He says, pursue what is good, and I will celebrate that it was not all vanity. That my work, Paul says, was to teach you about the Lord and to encourage you to follow him. And that work is good work. Church, when we're faced with a broken and dark and angry world, our job is not to be freed from the darkness or to feed the darkness, nor is it to hide from it, and nor is it to give up on it. It's not to throw up our hands and cry all is vanity and leave it to its own devices. We would be right to think that there's nothing we can do as human beings to fix the darkness of the world. We are truly powerless in and of ourselves. But God is not. And he works. He has worked. He does work. And he will work. The author ends this book by saying in chapter 12, verse 14, for God will bring every work into judgment, including every secret thing, whether good or evil. The world is broken, and our works seem not to impact anything. We'll talk more tomorrow about that struggle with injustice, but for now, know that God will handle it in the end. Our job is the meantime to do good and to teach good and to love. And that's enough to concern us. And it ought to be a joy to occupy ourselves with these things. Let me pray for just that. Lord, I thank you that you have made your truth so clear and that you have made our purpose so clear in bowing down before you, Lord, and trusting in you to judge and to have the end say. We thank you that you have equipped us to do good work for you, for your glory. Lord, may you help us in that work for you so that our lives would not be in vain, but would point people to you, to the cross, that they would come to know you as well. We love you, Lord. Amen. Thanks for spending a few minutes with me this morning talking about works and meaningfulness. Tomorrow we'll dive into the unfairness of the world and how we end up getting to rejoice over God's grace even in that. I'll see you then.